Question 1. System analysis indicates a client, recently experiencing a significant personal loss, expresses an urgent desire to liquidate a substantial portion of their investment portfolio to cover immediate non-essential expenses. The client appears distressed and is insistent on this course of action, stating they just want to feel secure. As a financial advisor operating under UK regulations and SISI guidelines, how should you proceed? Option A. Contact the client's family members to discuss the situation and seek their intervention in managing the client's financial decisions. Option B. Immediately proceed with the liquidation as requested by the client to alleviate their immediate anxiety and provide the requested sense of security. Option C. Advise the client that their emotional state is clouding their judgment and that such decisions should not be made while distressed, suggesting they return when they are feeling more rational. Option D. Acknowledge the client's distress, express empathy, and then schedule a follow-up meeting to thoroughly discuss the implications of liquidation, explore alternative solutions for their immediate needs, and assess the long-term impact on their financial goals before any action is taken. Correct answer is D. Acknowledge the client's distress, express empathy, and then schedule a follow-up meeting to thoroughly discuss the implications of liquidation, explore alternative solutions for their immediate needs, and assess the long-term impact on their financial goals before any action is taken. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preferences and the potential for those preferences to lead to suboptimal outcomes or even harm, particularly when those preferences are influenced by emotional distress or a lack of full understanding of the implications. The requirement for careful judgment arises from the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, which may necessitate challenging the client's immediate desires if they are not aligned with long-term financial well-being or regulatory compliance. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, empathetic, and informed client engagement. It involves actively listening to understand the underlying reasons for the client's emotional state and their stated preferences, then providing clear, objective, and comprehensive information about the implications of different choices. This aligns with regulatory expectations for client care, suitability, and the prevention of undue influence. Specifically, under UK regulations and SISI guidelines, financial advisors have a duty to ensure that advice is suitable for the client's circumstances and objectives, and that clients are not pressured into decisions they do not fully comprehend or that are not in their best interest. This approach upholds the principles of client welfare and professional integrity. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on fulfilling the client's immediate, emotionally driven request without further exploration or explanation would fail to meet the advisor's duty of care. This could lead to a breach of regulatory requirements concerning suitability and client understanding. For instance, simply agreeing to liquidate assets without discussing the tax implications, loss of potential future gains, or the impact on long-term goals would be professionally negligent. Another incorrect approach, that of dismissing the client's concerns as purely emotional and therefore irrelevant, would be ethically unsound and could alienate the client, preventing them from receiving necessary support and advice. It also disregards the potential for genuine, albeit emotionally expressed, underlying issues that need to be addressed. A third incorrect approach, that of immediately recommending a drastic course of action without exploring alternatives or the client's capacity to understand the consequences, would also fall short of professional standards, potentially leading to unsuitable recommendations and a failure to act in the client's best interest. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Active listening and empathy. Understand the client's emotional state and the root cause of their stated preferences. 2. Information gathering. Collect all relevant financial and personal information to assess the client's situation comprehensively. 3. Objective analysis. Evaluate the implications of various options, considering risks, rewards, and long-term consequences. 4. Clear communication. Explain complex information in an understandable manner, addressing the client's concerns directly and transparently. 5. Collaborative decision-making. Guide the client towards informed decisions that align with their best interests, even if it means gently challenging their initial impulses. 6. Documentation. Record all discussions, advice given, and decisions made to ensure accountability and compliance. Question 2. Investigation of a financial advisor's process for assessing a client's personality and behavioral traits to determine investment suitability. What approach best optimizes the process for accuracy and regulatory compliance? Option A. Employing a combination of validated psychometric assessments and structured behavioral interviews, with findings integrated into a comprehensive client profile. Option B. Relying primarily on the advisor's subjective interpretation of casual client conversations and personal rapport. Option C. Focusing exclusively on the client's stated financial goals and ignoring any behavioral or personality indicators. Option D. Using a generic personality questionnaire without tailoring it to the client's financial situation or the specific investment advice. The correct answer is A. Employing a combination of validated psychometric assessments and structured behavioral interviews, with findings integrated into a comprehensive client profile. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent subjectivity in assessing personality and behavioral traits, which are crucial for client suitability and risk management. The firm's obligation is to ensure that advice aligns with the client's best interests, which necessitates a robust and objective process for evaluating these behavioral aspects. The challenge lies in moving beyond superficial observations to a deeper understanding of the client's risk tolerance, decision-making biases, and emotional responses to market volatility. Careful judgment is required to avoid misinterpreting personality traits or allowing personal biases to influence the assessment. The correct approach, which involves utilizing a structured, multifaceted assessment methodology that includes validated psychometric tools and behavioral interviewing techniques, represents best professional practice. This method aims to provide a more objective and comprehensive understanding of the client's personality and behavioral profile. It aligns with regulatory expectations, assuming a jurisdiction like the UK with FCA principles that require firms to act in the best interests of clients and to conduct thorough client due diligence. Such a structured approach minimizes the risk of misjudging a client's capacity to understand and tolerate investment risk, thereby preventing unsuitable recommendations and potential client detriment. It also supports the firm's compliance with principles related to client understanding and suitability. An incorrect approach that relies solely on informal client conversations and the advisor's personal intuition fails to meet regulatory standards. This approach is ethically flawed because it introduces significant bias and lacks the rigor necessary to establish a well-founded understanding of the client's behavioral characteristics. It risks overlooking crucial behavioral indicators that might suggest a client is not suited for a particular investment strategy, leading to potential breaches of the duty to act in the client's best interests and to provide suitable advice. Such an approach could be seen as a failure to conduct adequate due diligence, potentially violating principles of client care and professional conduct. Another incorrect approach, which involves applying a standardized personality questionnaire without considering the client's specific financial context or the nature of the advice being provided, is also professionally deficient. While using a tool is a step towards structure, its uncritical application can lead to misinterpretations. For instance, a high score on a risk-seeking personality trait might not translate to a willingness to accept financial risk in a real-world investment scenario, especially if the client has significant dependence or short-term financial obligations. This approach fails to integrate the behavioral assessment with the practical realities of the client's financial situation and investment objectives, thereby undermining the suitability of the advice. It represents a failure to tailor the assessment to the specific needs and circumstances of the client, which is a core tenet of professional advisory practice. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a commitment to a systematic and evidence-based approach. This begins with understanding the regulatory requirements for client assessment and suitability. It then involves selecting appropriate tools and methodologies that are designed to elicit relevant behavioral information. Crucially, the professional must then interpret this information within the client's unique financial and personal circumstances, ensuring that the assessment directly informs the suitability of any proposed advice. Regular review and validation of the assessment process are also essential to maintain its effectiveness and compliance. Question 3. The risk matrix shows a significant opportunity to optimize the client onboarding process by reducing the average time from submission to account activation by 30%. The proposed solution involves a new automated system that streamlines data entry and verification. However, initial internal testing suggests that this automation might reduce the time available for relationship managers to conduct in-depth suitability assessments during the initial client contact. Which of the following approaches to implementing this process optimization is most aligned with regulatory and ethical best practices? Option A. Delay the implementation of the automated system indefinitely until a new system can be developed that guarantees no reduction in the time available for suitability assessments, even if it means foregoing the identified efficiency benefits. Option B. Prioritize the 30% efficiency gain by deploying the automated system across all new client onboarding, assuming that relationship managers can adapt their existing workflows to compensate for any reduced assessment time. Option C. Implement the automated system immediately to capture the efficiency gains, with a plan to address any client suitability concerns that arise post-implementation through additional training for relationship managers. Option D. Conduct a pilot program of the automated system with a small group of new clients, actively soliciting feedback from both the clients and the relationship managers involved, and use this feedback to refine the system and its integration into the onboarding workflow before a full rollout. The correct answer is C. Implement the automated system immediately to capture the efficiency gains, with a plan to address any client suitability concerns that arise post-implementation through additional training for relationship managers. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for efficiency and process optimization with the fundamental ethical and regulatory obligations to clients. The firm's desire to streamline operations must not come at the expense of thoroughness, accuracy, or the client's best interests, which are paramount. The regulatory framework for financial services, particularly concerning client interactions and advice, emphasizes a duty of care and a commitment to acting in the client's best interests. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a client-centric methodology for process optimization. This involves understanding how changes will impact client experience, data integrity, and the ability to provide tailored advice. It aligns with regulatory expectations that firms should not only comply with rules, but also foster a culture of client well-being. By involving client-facing staff and seeking client feedback, the firm demonstrates a commitment to transparency and responsiveness, which are key ethical tenets and often implicitly or explicitly required by regulatory bodies to ensure fair treatment of customers. This proactive engagement helps identify potential negative consequences before they affect clients, thereby mitigating risks and upholding the firm's reputation and regulatory standing. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on internal efficiency metrics without considering client impact would fail to meet regulatory obligations. For instance, implementing a new system that reduces the time spent on client onboarding, but omits crucial data points or makes it harder for clients to understand their investments would likely breach principles of fair treatment and potentially lead to mis-selling or inadequate advice, violating regulatory requirements. Another incorrect approach, such as automating client communication without human oversight for complex queries, could lead to generic or inappropriate responses, failing the duty to provide suitable advice and potentially causing client harm. This would be a failure to act with due skill, care, and diligence, a core regulatory expectation. Professionals should approach process optimization by first identifying the specific business objective. Then, they must assess the potential impact of any proposed changes on all stakeholders, with a particular focus on clients. This involves a risk-based approach, considering not only operational efficiency, but also regulatory compliance, ethical considerations, and client outcomes. A robust decision-making process would involve a pilot phase, gathering feedback from both staff and clients, and conducting a thorough review against regulatory requirements and ethical standards before full implementation. Question 4. Strategic planning requires a thorough review of existing operational processes to identify areas for improvement and efficiency gains. When considering how to analyze client interaction workflows to optimize service delivery and reduce operational costs, what is the most ethically sound and regulatorily compliant approach to gather and analyze the necessary data? Option A. Aggregate anonymized data on client interaction types, duration, and resolution times alongside general feedback trends to identify bottlenecks and areas for process streamlining. Option B. Focus exclusively on reducing the number of client touchpoints and communication channels to minimize overheads, regardless of potential impact on client satisfaction or regulatory requirements for communication. Option C. Directly review individual client case files and communication logs to pinpoint specific instances of inefficiency and identify advisors who may be deviating from standard procedures. Option D. Delegate the analysis of client interaction data to junior team members with minimal oversight, assuming they will understand the importance of confidentiality and efficient data handling. The correct answer is A. Aggregate anonymized data on client interaction types, duration, and resolution times, alongside general feedback trends, to identify bottlenecks and areas for process streamlining. Explanation. This scenario presents a challenge in balancing the need for efficient process optimization with the ethical imperative to maintain client confidentiality and avoid conflicts of interest, all within the stringent regulatory framework governing financial advice. The core difficulty lies in identifying and implementing improvements that benefit the firm and its clients without inadvertently exposing sensitive client information or creating situations where the advisor's personal interests could compromise their professional judgment. The correct approach prioritizes a systematic, data-driven review that anonymizes client-specific details before analysis. This method upholds the highest ethical standards by safeguarding client privacy, a fundamental requirement under regulations such as the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA Handbook, particularly SISC, Senior Management Arrangements, Systems and Controls, which mandates robust systems and controls to protect client assets and information. By focusing on aggregated data and process metrics, the advisor can identify inefficiencies without breaching confidentiality, thereby demonstrating professional integrity and adherence to regulatory obligations. This approach also fosters trust, a cornerstone of the client-advisor relationship. An incorrect approach that involves directly reviewing individual client files for patterns without explicit consent or robust anonymization mechanisms would represent a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This could lead to breaches of data protection laws, e.g., GDPR if applicable, or equivalent UK data protection legislation, and the FCA's principles for businesses, specifically Principle 7, communications with clients, and Principle 9, utmost good faith. Such an action could also create a conflict of interest if the advisor's personal financial situation or biases influence their interpretation of client data, violating Principle 6, customers' interests. Another incorrect approach, focusing solely on cost-cutting measures without considering the impact on client service or regulatory compliance, demonstrates a lack of holistic understanding. This could lead to the implementation of processes that, while cheaper, may inadvertently increase operational risk or reduce the quality of advice, contravening the FCA's expectation for firms to act with due skill, care, and diligence. A third incorrect approach, involving the delegation of process optimization to junior staff without adequate oversight or training on data handling and confidentiality, risks errors and potential breaches. This fails to meet the firm's responsibility under SISC to ensure that appropriate systems and controls are in place, and that staff are competent and aware of their regulatory obligations. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the firm's regulatory obligations, particularly concerning client data and conflicts of interest. Professionals should always begin by identifying the specific regulatory requirements applicable to the task. They should then consider the ethical implications of each potential action, prioritizing client interests and confidentiality. A structured approach, involving risk assessment and the development of mitigation strategies for any identified risks, is crucial. Seeking guidance from compliance departments or senior management, when in doubt, ensures adherence to best practices and regulatory standards. Question 5. Stakeholder feedback indicates a consistent pattern of client complaints regarding the time taken to process new account applications, suggesting operational inefficiencies. The head of operations proposes a streamlined digital onboarding process that significantly reduces manual data entry and verification steps, aiming to cut processing times by 50%. However, this proposal has not been reviewed by the compliance department or senior management, and the potential impact on data accuracy and client suitability checks is unclear, Which of the following represents the most appropriate next step for the firm? Option A. Inform the head of operations that the client complaints are likely due to client error and advise them to focus on improving client education rather than altering internal processes. Option B. Initiate a comprehensive review of the proposed digital onboarding process involving compliance, risk management, and client-facing teams to assess its impact on regulatory adherence, client suitability, and overall service quality before implementation. Option C. Delegate the review and implementation of the digital onboarding process solely to the IT department, trusting their technical expertise to ensure efficiency and compliance. Option D. Immediately implement the proposed digital onboarding process to address client complaints and demonstrate responsiveness to feedback, with a plan to address any compliance issues that may arise post-implementation. Correct answer is B. Initiate a comprehensive review of the proposed digital onboarding process involving compliance, risk management, and client-facing teams to assess its impact on regulatory adherence, client suitability, and overall service quality before implementation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for efficient operational processes with the imperative to maintain high ethical standards and client trust. The firm's reputation and regulatory standing are at risk if processes are optimized at the expense of client well-being or fair treatment. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any process improvements do not inadvertently lead to conflicts of interest, misrepresentation, or a decline in the quality of advice provided. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, client-centric review of feedback before implementing changes. This aligns with regulatory expectations for firms to act in the best interests of their clients and to have robust systems and controls in place. By involving relevant stakeholders, including compliance and senior management, the firm demonstrates a commitment to responsible decision-making and adherence to regulatory principles. This proactive and consultative method ensures that any proposed process optimizations are evaluated not only for efficiency, but also for their impact on client outcomes, fairness, and compliance with all applicable regulations. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on cost reduction without considering the impact on client service or regulatory compliance would be professionally unacceptable. This could lead to breaches of conduct rules requiring firms to treat clients fairly and with due skill, care, and diligence. Another incorrect approach that bypasses internal compliance procedures and senior management oversight would undermine the firm's governance framework and potentially expose it to regulatory sanctions for inadequate risk management and control failures. Such an approach disregards the importance of a structured and compliant implementation process. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the root cause of stakeholder feedback. This involves active listening, data gathering, and analysis. Next, potential solutions should be brainstormed, considering various perspectives and impacts. Crucially, each potential solution must be evaluated against regulatory requirements, ethical obligations, and the firm's strategic objectives, particularly concerning client interests. The chosen approach should then be subject to rigorous review and approval by appropriate internal governance bodies, including compliance and senior management, before implementation. Post-implementation monitoring and evaluation are also essential to ensure the desired outcomes are achieved without unintended negative consequences. Question 6. The analysis reveals that a long-standing client who has expressed significant emotional attachment to a specific, albeit underperforming, sector-specific investment from a previous bull market, is resistant to diversifying their portfolio. They believe this sector will inevitably rebound and are hesitant to consider alternative asset classes or strategies that your firm's research suggests are more appropriate for their current financial goals and risk profile. How should a financial advisor best proceed in this situation, adhering strictly to UK regulatory frameworks and SISI ethical guidelines? Option A. Immediately implement a strategy to gradually reduce the client's exposure to the underperforming sector, overriding their objections due to the perceived risk of inaction. Option B. Conduct a thorough review of the client's current financial situation, risk tolerance, and stated objectives, and then present a clear, evidence-based recommendation for a diversified portfolio, explaining the rationale and potential benefits while addressing the client's concerns about the specific sector. Option C. Advise the client that their emotional attachment to the sector is hindering sound financial decision-making and suggests they seek advice elsewhere if they cannot be objective. Option D. Agree to maintain the client's current investment in the sector, focusing on managing expectations and highlighting any minor positive movements to preserve the client relationship. The correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough review of the client's current financial situation, risk tolerance, and stated objectives, and then present a clear, evidence-based recommendation for a diversified portfolio, explaining the rationale and potential benefits while addressing the client's concerns about the specific sector. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preferences and the potential for those preferences to lead to suboptimal outcomes or even regulatory breaches. The financial advisor must navigate the client's emotional attachment to a particular investment strategy, which may be driven by past experiences or a misunderstanding of current market realities, while upholding their fiduciary duty and adhering to regulatory requirements. The advisor's judgment is critical in balancing client satisfaction with the imperative to provide sound, compliant advice. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, objective assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and objectives, aligning with the principles of Know Your Client kick and suitability. This approach ensures that any recommendations are grounded in data and regulatory guidelines, such as those found in the Financial Conduct Authority (FCA) Handbook, e.g., Cobb's Rules on Suitability and Client Understanding, and relevant SISI ethical codes. It demonstrates a commitment to acting in the client's best interests, fostering trust and long-term relationships, and mitigating the risk of mis-selling or poor client outcomes. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on appeasing the client's immediate emotional desires without a robust, documented assessment of suitability would represent a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This could breach FCA rules requiring advice to be suitable and for clients to understand the products and services recommended. Ethically, it would violate the principle of acting with integrity and in the client's best interests. Another incorrect approach, which involves dismissing the client's concerns outright and imposing a rigid, predetermined strategy, would fail to acknowledge the client's perspective and could lead to a breakdown in communication and trust, potentially also contravening the spirit of client-centric advice mandated by regulators. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with active listening and empathetic understanding of the client's perspective. This should be followed by a comprehensive fact-finding process to gather all relevant financial and personal information. The advisor must then objectively analyze this information against regulatory requirements and their firm's policies, considering various investment strategies and their suitability. The next step involves clearly communicating the rationale behind recommended strategies, explaining both the benefits and risks in a way the client can understand, and addressing any concerns transparently. If a client's stated preference conflicts with a suitable recommendation, the advisor must explain this conflict clearly, providing evidence and justification, and explore alternative solutions that may bridge the gap between the client's desires and their best financial interests, always documenting the entire process. Question 7. The assessment process reveals that a client exhibits a strong tendency towards risk aversion and a preference for predictable, short-term gains, which contrasts with their stated long-term financial goals. How should a financial advisor ethically and effectively utilize this information to provide tailored advice? Option A. Present a curated selection of low-risk, short-term investment products that align with the client's observed behavioral preferences, without explicitly discussing the discrepancy between their stated goals and their assessed personality traits. Option B. Archive the assessment findings and proceed with providing advice based solely on the client's stated financial goals, without referencing the behavioral insights, to avoid any potential for misinterpretation or overreach. Option C. Discuss the assessment findings openly with the client, explaining how their behavioral tendencies might impact their ability to achieve their stated goals, and collaboratively develop strategies that acknowledge and address these tendencies while working towards their objectives. Option D. Use the assessment findings to subtly steer the client towards more aggressive investment strategies that are better suited to their long-term goals, assuming the client will eventually understand the rationale. The correct answer is C. Discuss the assessment findings openly with the client, explaining how their behavioral tendencies might impact their ability to achieve their stated goals, and collaboratively develop strategies that acknowledge and address these tendencies while working towards their objectives. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need to understand a client's personality and behavioral traits for effective financial advice with the ethical and regulatory obligations to protect client confidentiality and avoid undue influence. The assessment process, while intended to be helpful, can inadvertently create a situation where sensitive personal information is used in a way that could be perceived as manipulative or intrusive, if not handled with extreme care and transparency. The professional must exercise sound judgment to ensure the assessment's insights are used solely for the client's benefit and in accordance with all applicable regulations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the client's informed consent and autonomy. By discussing the assessment findings openly with the client and seeking their agreement on how this information will be used to tailor advice, the professional upholds the principles of transparency and client centricity. This aligns with regulatory frameworks that emphasize client understanding and control over their financial affairs and personal data. Specifically, in the UK, this approach would be consistent with the principles of the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, regarding treating customers fairly and the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, concerning the lawful processing of personal data, requiring consent for specific purposes. It also reflects the CISI Code of Conduct, which stresses integrity, client interest, and professional competence. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on using the assessment data to guide the client towards specific products without explicit discussion and agreement would represent a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This could be seen as a breach of the FCA's principles, particularly Principle 6, Customers' Interests, and Principle 7, Communications with Clients, by potentially misleading or pressuring the client. It also risks violating data protection laws by using personal information for purposes not consented to. Furthermore, contravenes the CISI ethical standards by not acting with integrity and potentially prioritizing the firm's or advisor's interests over the client's. Another incorrect approach, which involves disregarding the assessment findings entirely due to concerns about potential misuse, would also be professionally suboptimal. While it avoids the risks of inappropriate use, it fails to leverage a valuable tool that could lead to more personalized and effective financial planning, thereby not fully acting in the client's best interest as required by regulations and ethical codes. This could be seen as a failure to exercise professional competence and diligence. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the regulatory landscape governing client interactions and data handling. Professionals should always seek to obtain informed consent for the use of any personal information gathered during assessments. Transparency about the purpose and application of assessment findings is paramount. When in doubt, erring on the side of caution and prioritizing client autonomy and data protection is the most ethically sound and legally compliant path. This involves a continuous evaluation of how personal data and behavioral insights can be ethically and effectively integrated into the advisory process to genuinely benefit the client. Question 8. Research into client financial decision-making reveals that stated preferences can sometimes be influenced by underlying behavioral biases. A financial advisor is working with a client who expresses a strong desire to invest in a highly speculative asset class, citing recent market trends as justification. However, the advisor's assessment of the client's risk tolerance, financial capacity, and long-term goals suggests this investment is not suitable. How should the advisor proceed to best uphold their professional and regulatory obligations? Option A. Directly advise the client that their chosen investment is irrational and unsuitable, explaining that their reasoning is flawed due to emotional decision-making, and refuse to proceed with the investment. Option B. Proceed with the investment as requested by the client, assuming that the client is fully informed and has the right to make their own decisions, regardless of the advisor's assessment of suitability. Option C. Gently explore the client's reasoning behind their interest in the speculative asset, discussing potential behavioral influences like recency bias or herd mentality, and then collaboratively develop an investment strategy that aligns with their stated goals and risk profile, potentially incorporating a small, carefully managed allocation if appropriate and fully understood by the client. Option D. Recommend a diversified portfolio that excludes the speculative asset class entirely, explaining that this is the only prudent course of action based on the advisor's professional judgment. The correct answer is C. Gently explore the client's reasoning behind their interest in the speculative asset, discussing potential behavioral influences like recency bias or herd mentality, and then collaboratively develop an investment strategy that aligns with their stated goals and risk profile, potentially incorporating a small, carefully managed allocation if appropriate and fully understood by the client. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preferences and their underlying behavioral patterns, which may not align with their stated goals. A financial advisor must navigate this delicate balance, ensuring they act in the client's best interest while respecting their autonomy. The challenge lies in identifying when a client's stated wishes are driven by cognitive biases or emotional responses that could lead to detrimental financial outcomes, and how to address this without alienating the client or overstepping professional boundaries. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough understanding of the client's behavioral drivers before making recommendations. This aligns with regulatory frameworks that mandate suitability and acting in the client's best interest. By seeking to understand the why behind the client's preferences, the advisor can identify potential behavioral biases, e.g., loss aversion, confirmation bias, that might be influencing their decisions. This deeper insight allows for tailored advice that addresses both the stated goal and the underlying behavioral tendencies, leading to more robust and sustainable financial planning. It also fosters trust and transparency, as the client feels understood and their concerns are genuinely addressed. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the client's stated preference, without probing deeper, fails to uphold the duty of care. This could lead to recommendations that are technically aligned with the client's words, but not their true, long-term financial well-being. This might constitute a breach of regulatory requirements concerning suitability and fiduciary duty, as the advisor has not exercised due diligence in understanding the client's complete financial picture, including their behavioral predispositions. Another incorrect approach, which involves directly confronting the client about their perceived irrationality, is professionally unacceptable. While the advisor may have identified a behavioral issue, a confrontational style can damage the client relationship, erode trust, and make the client resistant to any advice, however sound. This approach lacks empathy and can be perceived as condescending, violating ethical principles of client respect and professional conduct. A third incorrect approach, which involves overriding the client's wishes without adequate justification or discussion, is also a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This demonstrates a lack of respect for client autonomy and can lead to accusations of unauthorized decision-making or a failure to obtain informed consent. While the advisor may believe they know best, the process of financial advice requires collaboration and client buy-in. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Active listening and empathy. Fully understand the client's stated goals and concerns. 2. Behavioral assessment. Discreetly observe and inquire about the client's decision-making process, looking for patterns that might indicate behavioral biases. 3. Hypothesis generation. Formulate hypotheses about the underlying behavioral drivers influencing the client's preferences. 4. Gentle probing and education. Ask open-ended questions to explore these hypotheses, educating the client about potential biases and their impact in a non-judgmental way. 5. Collaborative solutioning. Work with the client to develop strategies that acknowledge their stated preferences while mitigating the risks associated with their behavioral patterns. 6. Documentation. Maintain clear records of discussions, assessments, and the rationale behind recommendations. Question 9. Examination of the data shows a client consistently expresses a strong preference for low-risk investments, yet their transaction history reveals a pattern of frequent, high-risk trading activity, often resulting in significant losses. The client has also indicated a desire for capital preservation. What is the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor in this situation? Option A. Proceed with investment recommendations based solely on the client's stated preference for low-risk investments, assuming their stated preference is the most accurate reflection of their current desires. Option B. Interpret the client's trading behavior as an indication that they are more risk-tolerant than they realize and proceed with investment recommendations that align with this perceived higher risk tolerance. Option C. Conduct a detailed behavioral assessment to understand the underlying reasons for the discrepancy between the client's stated preferences and their trading behavior, and then engage in a structured discussion with the client about these findings and their implications for their financial goals. Option D. Advise the client that their trading behavior contradicts their stated investment goals and recommend they cease all trading activity immediately. Correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed behavioral assessment to understand the underlying reasons for the discrepancy between the client's stated preferences and their trading behavior, and then engage in a structured discussion with the client about these findings and their implications for their financial goals. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preferences and their observed behavioral patterns, particularly when those patterns suggest potential financial detriment. The advisor must navigate this delicate situation with a high degree of ethical consideration and adherence to regulatory principles designed to protect clients. The core challenge lies in balancing the client's autonomy with the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, which includes safeguarding them from potentially harmful decisions. The correct approach, which involves a thorough behavioral assessment and a structured discussion about the observed discrepancies, represents best professional practice because it aligns with the principles of informed consent and client well-being. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing financial advice, often mandate that advisors understand their clients' risk tolerance, financial goals, and behavioral biases. By identifying and addressing the disconnect between stated preferences and actual behavior, the advisor fulfills their duty to provide suitable advice and to ensure the client fully comprehends the implications of their decisions. This proactive engagement helps prevent future regret and potential regulatory complaints. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the client's stated preference, ignoring the behavioral data, fails to uphold the advisor's duty of care and suitability. This could lead to advice that is not truly in the client's best interest, potentially exposing them to undue risk or missed opportunities. Ethically, this is a failure to act with diligence and competence. Another incorrect approach, which involves making assumptions about the client's motivations without direct discussion, is also professionally unacceptable. This bypasses the crucial step of client engagement and can lead to misinterpretations and inappropriate recommendations. It demonstrates a lack of respect for the client's agency and a failure to gather all necessary information. A third incorrect approach, which involves dismissing the behavioral data as irrelevant, ignores the fundamental principle that understanding client behavior is integral to providing effective and ethical financial advice. This oversight can lead to a misdiagnosis of the client's needs and ultimately to unsuitable recommendations. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with comprehensive data gathering, including both stated preferences and observable behaviors. This should be followed by a structured analysis to identify any discrepancies. The next critical step is to engage the client in an open and honest discussion about these findings, using non-judgmental language. The advisor should then collaboratively explore the reasons behind the observed behaviors and their potential impact on financial goals. Finally, the advisor should ensure the client makes an informed decision, documenting the discussion and the rationale for the chosen course of action. Question 10. The efficiency study reveals that a client's stated investment objective is aggressive growth, yet their behavioral responses during market downturns consistently indicate a strong aversion to volatility and a tendency to panic sell. Which approach best balances the client's stated goals with their demonstrated behavioral patterns to ensure their long-term financial well-being and adherence to regulatory principles? Option A. Advise the client to significantly lower their growth objective to a very conservative level, as their behavioral aversion to volatility suggests they are incapable of handling any significant market fluctuations. Option B. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client about their risk tolerance, using behavioral assessment tools to understand their emotional responses to market fluctuations, and then construct a portfolio that aligns with both their stated growth objective and their demonstrated aversion to volatility, documenting the rationale thoroughly. Option C. Focus solely on the efficiency study's findings regarding potential portfolio optimization, recommending a highly diversified but potentially volatile strategy that maximizes theoretical returns, irrespective of the client's behavioral reactions. Option D. Prioritize the client's stated aggressive growth objective, as this is their explicit instruction, and select investments accordingly, assuming they will eventually adapt to market volatility. The correct answer is B. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client about their risk tolerance, using behavioral assessment tools to understand their emotional responses to market fluctuations, and then construct a portfolio that aligns with both their stated growth objective and their demonstrated aversion to volatility, documenting the rationale thoroughly. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge stemming from the inherent conflict between a client's stated preferences and their observable behavior, particularly when those preferences relate to risk tolerance and investment objectives. The financial advisor must navigate this discrepancy while adhering to their professional and regulatory obligations. The core of the challenge lies in interpreting and acting upon potentially contradictory information to ensure the client's best interests are met, a fundamental tenet of financial advisory practice. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, documented understanding of the client's situation, aligning stated goals with actual capacity and willingness to take risk. This involves a multifaceted assessment that goes beyond superficial responses. By engaging in open dialogue, utilizing behavioral assessment tools, and considering the client's broader financial context, the advisor builds a comprehensive picture. This holistic view allows for the construction of a portfolio that is not only aligned with stated objectives, but also realistically achievable and sustainable given the client's behavioral tendencies. This aligns with regulatory requirements, e.g., FCA's Principles for Businesses, specifically Principle 6, Customers' Interests, and Principle 7, Communications with Clients, which mandate acting honestly, with integrity, and in the best interests of clients, requiring a deep understanding of their needs and circumstances. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the client's stated preferences without probing deeper into behavioral indicators risks misinterpreting the client's true risk appetite. This could lead to recommendations that are either too conservative, failing to meet potential growth objectives, or too aggressive, exposing the client to undue risk they are not psychologically prepared to handle. Such a failure to conduct adequate due diligence on the client's behavioral profile constitutes a breach of regulatory duty to act in the client's best interests and could be seen as a failure to adequately assess suitability, a key regulatory requirement. Another incorrect approach that relies solely on quantitative data from the efficiency study, ignoring qualitative behavioral insights, would be similarly flawed. While the study might highlight potential inefficiencies, it does not capture the client's emotional response to market volatility or their decision-making under pressure. This oversight could lead to recommendations that are technically efficient but practically unworkable for the client, again failing the best interests and suitability obligations. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Initial assessment. Gather all available information, including stated goals, financial situation, and any preliminary behavioral observations. 2. Deep dive into behavior. Employ a combination of direct questioning, behavioral questionnaires, and scenario-based discussions to understand the client's risk tolerance, emotional responses to financial events, and decision-making biases. 3. Reconciliation. Compare stated preferences with observed behaviors and capacity for risk. Identify any discrepancies. 4. Informed recommendation. Develop investment strategies that are demonstrably aligned with both stated objectives and the client's behavioral profile, ensuring suitability and appropriateness. 5. Documentation. Meticulously record all assessments, discussions, and the rationale behind recommendations. This provides a clear audit trail and demonstrates adherence to professional standards and regulatory requirements. 6. Ongoing monitoring. Regularly review the client's portfolio and their behavioral responses to market conditions, making adjustments as necessary. Question 11. To address the challenge of providing objective financial advice when personal biases and financial incentives might influence recommendations, which decision-making approach best upholds professional integrity and regulatory compliance? Option A. Prioritizing the recommendation of investment products that offer higher commission rates or bonuses to the advisor, as this directly contributes to the firm's profitability and the advisor's personal income. Option B. Systematically evaluating the client's unique circumstances and financial goals, rigorously assessing a diverse range of suitable investment options, and proactively identifying and managing any potential conflicts of interest through transparent disclosure and objective decision-making processes. Option C. Relying on personal experience and conviction regarding specific investment strategies that have historically yielded positive results, assuming these will be universally beneficial for all clients. Option D. Adopting a simplified advisory process that avoids in-depth analysis or potentially uncomfortable discussions about risk, focusing instead on maintaining a positive and agreeable client relationship. The correct answer is B. Systematically evaluating the client's unique circumstances and financial goals, rigorously assessing a diverse range of suitable investment options, and proactively identifying and managing any potential conflicts of interest through transparent disclosure and objective decision-making processes. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge where a financial advisor must balance client needs with regulatory obligations and their own potential biases. The advisor's personal financial situation and emotional attachment to a particular investment strategy could cloud their judgment, leading to recommendations that are not solely in the client's best interest. This requires a robust decision-making framework to ensure objectivity and adherence to professional standards. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes a structured, objective decision-making process that prioritizes the client's interests and complies with regulatory requirements. This involves a systematic evaluation of the client's circumstances, risk tolerance, and financial goals, followed by a thorough analysis of suitable investment options. The advisor must also proactively identify and mitigate any potential conflicts of interest, ensuring transparency and documentation throughout the process. This aligns with the fundamental principles of fiduciary duty and client-centric advice, as mandated by regulatory bodies like the FCA in the UK, which requires advisors to act honestly, with integrity, and in the best interests of their clients at all times. Incorrect approach is analysis. An approach that relies solely on personal conviction or past successes without objective validation fails to meet regulatory standards. It risks overlooking crucial client-specific factors and may lead to unsuitable recommendations, violating the duty to act in the client's best interests. This could be seen as a breach of conduct rules requiring due diligence and suitability assessments, an approach that prioritizes the advisor's personal financial gain or the promotion of products they are incentivized to sell, even if not the most suitable for the client, constitutes a serious conflict of interest. This directly contravenes regulations that prohibit or require disclosure and management of such conflicts, and it undermines the trust essential to the advisor-client relationship. An approach that avoids difficult conversations or complex analysis to maintain a superficial client relationship, while seemingly client-friendly, is professionally negligent. It fails to adequately assess the client's needs and risks, potentially leading to detrimental financial outcomes for the client and exposing the advisor to regulatory sanctions for failing to provide appropriate advice. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that includes 1. Information gathering, thoroughly understanding the client's financial situation, objectives, risk tolerance, and any constraints. 2. Objective analysis, evaluating a range of suitable investment options based on data and research, independent of personal biases or incentives. 3. Conflict identification and management, proactively identifying potential conflicts of interest and implementing strategies to mitigate or disclose them. 4. Recommendation and justification, clearly articulating the rationale behind recommendations, ensuring they align with the client's best interests and regulatory requirements. 5. Documentation, maintaining detailed records of all advice, decisions, and client interactions. Question 12. Analysis of a financial advisor's decision-making process when a client, who has previously expressed a moderate risk tolerance, requests to invest a significant portion of their portfolio in a highly speculative, illiquid asset class that is inconsistent with their stated risk profile. The advisor has conducted a thorough suitability assessment and believes this investment would be detrimental to the client's long-term financial goals. Option A. Advisor immediately executes the client's requested investment, assuming the client is fully aware of the risks and has overriding authority. Option B. The advisor explains to the client why the requested investment is not suitable based on their stated risk tolerance and financial goals, and proposes an alternative investment strategy that aligns with the client's profile, while still addressing any underlying interest the client may have in higher growth potential. Option C. The advisor informs the client that their request cannot be fulfilled due to the speculative nature of the asset class and advises them to seek advice elsewhere if they are insistent. Option D. The advisor proceeds with the investment as requested, but includes a disclaimer in the documentation stating that the client insisted on the investment despite the advisor's reservations. The correct answer is B. The advisor explains to the client why the requested investment is not suitable based on their stated risk tolerance and financial goals, and proposes an alternative investment strategy that aligns with the client's profile, while still addressing any underlying interest the client may have in higher growth potential. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference and the advisor's professional judgment regarding suitability. The advisor must navigate this by adhering to regulatory obligations that prioritize client well-being and suitability over mere compliance with a client's potentially ill-informed wishes. The challenge lies in effectively communicating the rationale for a different recommendation without alienating the client or appearing dismissive. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it demonstrates adherence to the core principles of client-centric advice, specifically the duty to recommend suitable investments. This aligns with regulatory frameworks that mandate advisors to understand their client's circumstances, objectives, and risk tolerance before making recommendations. By proposing an alternative that better aligns with the client's stated risk tolerance and financial goals, the advisor fulfills their fiduciary or equivalent duty to act in the client's best interest. This proactive stance prevents potential future harm to the client and upholds the integrity of the advisory relationship. An incorrect approach that involves simply executing the client's request without further due diligence or discussion represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This failure stems from a dereliction of the advisor's duty to assess suitability. It could lead to the client investing in products that are too risky, too complex, or otherwise inappropriate for their financial situation, potentially resulting in financial loss and regulatory sanctions for the advisor. Another incorrect approach, that of dismissing the client's request outright without attempting to understand the underlying reasons or offering alternatives, is also ethically problematic. It fails to respect the client's autonomy and can damage the professional relationship, potentially leading the client to seek advice elsewhere or act without professional guidance. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework when faced with such situations. This framework typically involves 1. Understanding the client's stated request and underlying motivations. 2. Assessing the request against regulatory requirements for suitability, considering the client's financial situation, objectives, and risk tolerance. 3. Identifying any discrepancies or potential conflicts between the request and suitability requirements. 4. Developing alternative recommendations that address the client's underlying needs while remaining suitable. 5. Communicating these findings and recommendations to the client clearly and empathetically, explaining the rationale and potential implications of both the requested action and the recommended alternative. 6. Documenting the entire process, including client discussions and decisions. Question 13. Cost-benefit analysis shows that a highly speculative short-term trading strategy could potentially yield significant immediate profits for a client, but also carries a substantial risk of rapid capital loss and is not aligned with the client's stated long-term retirement goals. The client, however, is expressing anxiety about current market conditions and a strong desire for quick gains to alleviate this stress. Which decision-making approach best balances the client's immediate emotional state with the advisor's professional obligations? Option A. Advise the client to pursue the speculative trading strategy, emphasizing the potential for quick profits to address their immediate anxiety, while downplaying the associated risks. Option B. Recommend a diversified portfolio of investments that aligns with the client's long-term retirement goals, clearly explaining the rationale and managing expectations regarding short-term market fluctuations. Option C. Suggest a temporary allocation to a very low-risk, low-return asset class to calm the client's immediate anxieties, even if it significantly deviates from their long-term investment plan. Option D. Proceed with the speculative trading strategy as requested by the client, assuming their expressed desire for quick gains overrides the advisor's professional judgment and regulatory duties. The correct answer is B. Recommend a diversified portfolio of investments that aligns with the client's long-term retirement goals, clearly explaining the rationale and managing expectations regarding short-term market fluctuations. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge rooted in the inherent conflict between immediate client needs and the long-term implications of regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. The advisor faces pressure to deliver a solution that satisfies the client's desire for rapid gains, while simultaneously upholding their fiduciary duty and adhering to the strict regulatory framework governing financial advice. The challenge lies in balancing the client's emotional state and immediate financial objectives with the objective, data-driven assessment required by a sound decision-making process. This requires a nuanced understanding of the client's risk tolerance, financial goals, and the potential consequences of various investment strategies, all within the bounds of regulatory requirements. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes a structured, client-centric decision-making framework that integrates regulatory compliance and ethical considerations. This involves a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives, followed by the development of a diversified portfolio aligned with these factors. The advisor must clearly articulate the rationale behind their recommendations, including potential risks and rewards, and ensure the client fully understands the implications of their investment choices. This approach upholds the advisor's fiduciary duty by acting in the client's best interest, adhering to regulatory guidelines that mandate suitability and transparency, and fostering a long-term, trust-based relationship. It demonstrates professional integrity by resisting undue pressure and prioritizing sound financial planning over speculative or potentially unsuitable strategies. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that solely focuses on the client's immediate desire for high returns without a comprehensive risk assessment or consideration of long-term suitability would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This could lead to recommendations that are not in the client's best interest, potentially exposing them to undue risk and violating the principle of suitability. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's concerns about market volatility and proceed with a strategy that ignores their expressed risk aversion, thereby failing to act in good faith and potentially breaching fiduciary obligations. Furthermore, an approach that prioritizes speed of execution over thorough due diligence and client understanding, perhaps by pushing through a complex or ill-understood product, would also constitute a failure to meet regulatory standards for client care and transparency. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a deep understanding of the client's circumstances, including their financial goals, risk tolerance, and time horizon. This is followed by an objective analysis of available investment options, considering their potential returns, risks, and alignment with the client's profile. Regulatory requirements, such as suitability rules and disclosure obligations, must be integrated at every stage. Ethical considerations, particularly the fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, should guide all recommendations. Open and transparent communication with the client, ensuring they comprehend the rationale and implications of proposed strategies, is paramount. This structured approach, often referred to as a client-centric or suitability-based framework, ensures that decisions are well-informed, compliant, and ethically sound, fostering trust and long-term client relationships. Question 14. The audit findings indicate a discrepancy in the expense recognition for a significant project, which, while not individually material, collectively suggests a pattern of aggressive accounting. Your senior colleague, who is responsible for the project's oversight, suggests that the issue is minor and can be resolved internally without formal documentation in the audit report, assuring you it will be corrected in the next reporting cycle. How should you proceed? Option A. Directly challenge the senior colleague's judgment in front of the audit team, demanding an immediate explanation for the accounting treatment. Option B. Document the finding in the working papers with a clear explanation of the discrepancy and its potential implications, and then escalate the matter to the audit manager for review and further action. Option C. Ignore the finding to avoid creating friction with the senior colleague and maintain a harmonious working relationship. Option D. Accept the senior colleague's assurance and make a note to follow up on the correction in the next audit cycle, without further documentation in the current working papers. The correct answer is B. Document the finding in the working papers with a clear explanation of the discrepancy and its potential implications, and then escalate the matter to the audit manager for review and further action. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the auditor is faced with a conflict between their professional duty to report findings accurately and the potential for negative repercussions from a senior colleague. The pressure to overlook or downplay a significant finding, even if seemingly minor in isolation, can compromise the integrity of the audit process and the reliability of the financial statements. Careful judgment is required to navigate this situation ethically and professionally. The correct approach, which involves documenting the finding thoroughly and escalating it through appropriate channels, represents best professional practice because it upholds the fundamental principles of auditing. This includes objectivity, integrity, and professional skepticism. By adhering to established audit procedures and reporting lines, the auditor ensures that all material issues are brought to light for proper investigation and resolution. This aligns with regulatory requirements for accurate financial reporting and the ethical obligations of auditors to act in the public interest. An incorrect approach of accepting the senior colleague's assurance without further investigation would represent a failure to exercise professional skepticism. This could lead to the concealment of potential misstatements or fraud, thereby misleading stakeholders and violating regulatory mandates for transparency and accuracy. Another incorrect approach, that of directly confronting the senior colleague in a public or accusatory manner without first gathering all facts and following internal procedures, could be seen as unprofessional and potentially damaging to working relationships, while still failing to ensure the finding is properly addressed. A third incorrect approach, that of ignoring the finding altogether to avoid conflict, is a clear breach of professional duty and ethical standards, as it prioritizes personal comfort over professional responsibility and regulatory compliance. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to professional standards and regulatory requirements. This involves 1. Identifying the core issue and potential ethical conflicts. 2. Consulting relevant professional standards, codes of conduct, and internal policies. 3. Gathering all necessary facts and evidence. 4. Documenting all steps taken and decisions made. 5. Escalating the issue through appropriate channels if resolution cannot be achieved at the initial level, ensuring that the integrity of the audit and the accuracy of financial reporting are maintained. Question 15. What factors determine the potential impact of a client's personality and behavioral patterns on their financial decision-making and suitability for specific investment strategies? Option A. The perceived social status and professional background of the client. Option B. General assumptions about individuals based on their age group and perceived level of financial literacy. Option C. The client's stated preference for specific investment products, regardless of their underlying behavioral characteristics. Option D. A comprehensive assessment of the client's past financial experiences, stated attitudes towards risk, observed communication styles, and demonstrated decision-making tendencies. The correct answer is D. A comprehensive assessment of the client's past financial experiences, stated attitudes towards risk, observed communication styles, and demonstrated decision-making tendencies. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to assess the potential impact of a client's personality traits and behavioral patterns on their financial decision-making and overall suitability for a particular investment strategy. The challenge lies in moving beyond superficial observations to a deeper understanding of how ingrained characteristics might influence risk tolerance, emotional responses to market volatility, and adherence to long-term financial plans. Careful judgment is required to avoid stereotyping or making assumptions, and instead, to focus on observable behaviors and their potential implications within a regulated financial context. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a holistic and evidence-based assessment of the client's behavioral predispositions. This involves considering a range of factors that are demonstrably linked to financial behavior, such as past financial experiences, stated attitudes towards risk, and observed communication styles. This approach aligns with regulatory expectations that professionals act in the client's best interest, which necessitates understanding the client's capacity to understand and manage the risks associated with financial advice. Ethically, it promotes fairness and avoids discriminatory practices by focusing on relevant behavioral indicators rather than personal characteristics that are not directly related to financial suitability. An incorrect approach that relies solely on superficial observations or stereotypes would fail to meet professional standards. For instance, assuming a client's risk tolerance based on their profession or social background, without further investigation, could lead to inappropriate recommendations and a failure to act in the client's best interest. This would be a regulatory failure as it bypasses the due diligence required to understand a client's individual circumstances and risk profile. Another incorrect approach might be to ignore any behavioral indicators that suggest potential challenges, such as a history of impulsive decisions, under the assumption that the client will simply follow advice. This would be an ethical failure, as it neglects a professional duty to identify and address potential client vulnerabilities that could lead to detrimental financial outcomes. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, gather information through open-ended questions and active listening, focusing on the client's past experiences, future goals, and current attitudes towards financial matters. Second, observe behavioral cues during interactions, such as communication patterns, emotional responses, and decision-making styles, without making premature judgments. Third, synthesize this information with relevant financial knowledge and regulatory guidelines to form a comprehensive understanding of the client's profile. Finally, use this understanding to tailor advice and recommendations that are appropriate for the client's specific circumstances and behavioral tendencies, ensuring transparency and ongoing review. Question 16. The assessment process reveals that a client exhibits a highly analytical and detail-oriented personality, often expressing a preference for data-driven decision-making and a cautious approach to uncertainty. How should a financial advisor best leverage this information to provide suitable and effective advice? Option A. Assume the client will be risk-averse and therefore only recommend the most conservative investment products available, regardless of their stated financial goals. Option B. Use the insights to present complex financial strategies with extensive supporting data and logical explanations, allowing the client to thoroughly review and analyze before making a decision. Option C. Interpret the client's analytical nature as a sign of low financial literacy and simplify all recommendations to basic terms, avoiding any complex product discussions. Option D. Discount the personality assessment as irrelevant to financial planning and proceed with standard, generic advice. The correct answer is B. Use the insights to present complex financial strategies with extensive supporting data and logical explanations, allowing the client to thoroughly review and analyze before making a decision. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need to understand a client's personality and behavioral traits for effective financial advice with the ethical obligation to avoid making assumptions or judgments that could lead to discriminatory practices or misinterpretations of their financial capacity. The assessment process, while intended to be helpful, can inadvertently highlight differences that, if not handled with sensitivity and a focus on objective financial needs, could lead to biased recommendations. Careful judgment is required to ensure the assessment serves its intended purpose without creating undue influence or prejudice. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it focuses on integrating the behavioral insights gained from the assessment into a holistic understanding of the client's financial decision-making process. This involves using the information to tailor communication, explain complex financial concepts in a way that resonates with the client's cognitive style, and identify potential behavioral biases that might impact their financial choices. This aligns with the principles of providing suitable advice and acting in the client's best interests, as mandated by regulatory frameworks that emphasize client understanding and tailored recommendations. It avoids stereotyping and instead uses personality insights as a tool for enhanced client service and risk management. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the client's perceived risk aversion based on their personality traits, without considering other factors or validating these assumptions with the client, represents a regulatory and ethical failure. This could lead to unsuitable recommendations, potentially breaching the duty to act in the client's best interests. It also risks misinterpreting the client's true financial capacity and needs, leading to advice that is not appropriate. Another incorrect approach, which dismisses the behavioral assessment entirely as irrelevant to financial advice, fails to leverage a valuable tool for understanding client behavior and potential biases. This can result in generic advice that may not be effectively understood or adopted by the client, thereby not fully meeting the professional obligation to provide advice that is suitable and actionable. A third incorrect approach, which uses the personality assessment to make broad generalizations about the client's financial literacy or ability to understand complex products, is ethically problematic and potentially discriminatory. It moves from understanding behavioral tendencies to making unfounded assumptions about cognitive abilities, which can lead to unsuitable recommendations and a failure to treat the client with respect and fairness. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the purpose and limitations of any assessment tool. They must then critically evaluate the information gathered, seeking to integrate it with objective financial data and client-stated goals. The focus should always be on how behavioral insights can inform the delivery of advice and enhance client engagement, rather than dictating the advice itself. This involves open communication with the client to validate any interpretations and ensure that the advice remains client-centric and aligned with their actual financial situation and objectives. Question 17. Regulatory review indicates a potential for interpersonal friction within a client-facing team, stemming from reported behavioral patterns of one team member that are causing discomfort and impacting team dynamics. The firm's management is aware of these reports. What is the most appropriate initial step to address this situation, ensuring compliance with professional conduct and ethical guidelines? Option A. Conduct a confidential, structured meeting with the employee to discuss the specific behavioral concerns, provide examples, and outline clear expectations for improvement, while also offering support resources. Option B. Initiate an informal team meeting to discuss general team dynamics and encourage open communication, without specifically naming the individual or their reported behaviors. Option C. Advise the reporting team members to document all future interactions with the individual and to avoid direct engagement where possible, until the situation naturally resolves. Option D. Immediately issue a formal written warning to the employee, detailing the reported behavioral issues and the potential consequences if they persist, without prior direct discussion. Correct answer is A. Conduct a confidential, structured meeting with the employee to discuss the specific behavioral concerns, provide examples, and outline clear expectations for improvement, while also offering support resources. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent subjectivity in assessing personality and behavioral traits, especially when they could influence client interactions and regulatory compliance. The firm's obligation is to ensure that its representatives act with integrity and competence, which includes managing potential conflicts arising from personality clashes or behavioral tendencies that might compromise client interests or regulatory adherence. The challenge lies in balancing the need for a harmonious working environment with the imperative to uphold professional standards and protect clients. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a structured, objective, and documented process for addressing the behavioral concerns. This aligns with the principles of fair treatment, due process, and the firm's responsibility to manage its employees effectively and ethically. By initiating a formal, confidential discussion with the employee, gathering specific examples, and outlining expectations for improvement, the firm demonstrates a commitment to addressing the issue constructively while adhering to internal policies and potentially relevant employment law guidelines regarding performance management. This approach prioritizes a resolution that benefits both the employee and the firm, minimizing disruption and potential future issues. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediate disciplinary action without prior discussion or an opportunity for the employee to understand and address the concerns. This fails to adhere to principles of natural justice and can be seen as arbitrary and unfair, potentially leading to grievances or legal challenges. It bypasses the opportunity for constructive feedback and improvement, which is a key aspect of professional development and employee management. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the reported behaviors, assuming they will resolve themselves or are not significant enough to warrant intervention. This is a failure of professional responsibility. The firm has a duty to ensure its employees conduct themselves appropriately, especially when their behavior impacts others or the firm's reputation. Ignoring such issues can create a toxic work environment, lead to client dissatisfaction, and potentially expose the firm to regulatory scrutiny if the behaviors escalate or lead to breaches of conduct. A third incorrect approach is to involve other team members in an informal discussion about the employee's behavior without a clear process or objective. This can foster gossip, create a hostile work environment, and breach confidentiality, undermining trust within the team, and potentially leading to accusations of bullying or harassment. It lacks the professionalism and structure required for effective performance management and conflict resolution. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first seeking to understand the facts objectively. This involves confidential conversations with the reporting party and, crucially, with the employee in question. The process should be guided by the firm's internal policies on employee conduct and performance management, as well as any applicable employment legislation. The focus should always be on addressing the behavior, not the personality, and providing a clear path for improvement. Documentation is essential at each stage to ensure transparency and accountability. Question 18. Quality control measures reveal that a junior financial advisor has been observed on multiple occasions engaging in overly familiar conversations with clients, including sharing personal anecdotes and discussing non-work-related matters for extended periods during client meetings. While no explicit complaints have been received, the compliance officer is concerned about the potential impact on client perception, professional boundaries, and the firm's reputation for professionalism. What is the most appropriate initial step for the compliance officer to take? Option A. Advise other team members to monitor the advisor's interactions closely and report any further instances of inappropriate behavior. Option B. Ignore the observations, as no client complaints have been formally lodged, and the behavior is not explicitly prohibited by a specific regulation. Option C. Conduct a discreet review of the advisor's client communication records and conduct a confidential discussion with the advisor to understand their perspective and explain the firm's expectations regarding professional conduct and client interaction. Option D. Immediately issue a formal written warning to the advisor, citing a breach of professional conduct and outlining the potential consequences if the behavior continues. The correct answer is C. Conduct a discreet review of the advisor's client communication records and conduct a confidential discussion with the advisor to understand their perspective and explain the firm's expectations regarding professional conduct and client interaction. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need to address potential misconduct with the principles of fairness and due process. The compliance officer must assess the impact of the observed behavior on client relationships, regulatory compliance, and the firm's reputation, all while adhering to internal policies and relevant regulations. The core of the challenge lies in determining the appropriate level of intervention without prejudging the situation or causing undue distress to the employee. The correct approach involves a structured, evidence-based impact assessment. This aligns with best professional practice by ensuring that any actions taken are proportionate to the observed behavior and its potential consequences. Specifically, it upholds the regulatory expectation of maintaining robust internal controls and fostering an ethical culture. By gathering information, considering the context, and consulting relevant policies, the compliance officer demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to fair treatment. This process minimizes the risk of arbitrary or discriminatory action, which could lead to reputational damage for the firm and potential legal repercussions. An incorrect approach of immediately issuing a formal written warning without further investigation would be a regulatory and ethical failure. It bypasses the fundamental principle of natural justice, which requires an individual to be heard before a decision is made. This could violate internal disciplinary procedures and potentially employment law, leading to claims of unfair dismissal or harassment. Another incorrect approach, such as ignoring the behavior due to its perceived minor nature, represents a failure to uphold the firm's duty of care and regulatory obligations to monitor employee conduct. This inaction could allow a pattern of problematic behavior to develop, escalating into more serious breaches and exposing the firm to significant risk. A third incorrect approach, involving gossip or informal disparagement of the employee to colleagues, is a clear breach of professional ethics and confidentiality. It undermines trust within the workplace, creates a hostile environment, and could lead to defamation claims. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the firm's internal policies on conduct and disciplinary procedures. They should then gather objective information about the observed behavior, considering its frequency, severity, and any potential impact. This information should be analyzed in the context of relevant regulatory requirements and ethical codes. The next step is to determine if the behavior constitutes a breach of policy or regulation. If so, the appropriate course of action, which may include further investigation, a formal discussion, or disciplinary measures, should be decided in consultation with HR and senior management, ensuring fairness and proportionality throughout the process. Question 19. Governance review demonstrates that a long-serving, high-performing client relationship manager, while consistently exceeding revenue targets, exhibits interpersonal behaviors that have led to several informal client complaints regarding perceived dismissiveness and a lack of empathy during challenging discussions. The team lead has observed these behaviors and believes they are detrimental to the overall client experience and team morale. Despite the manager's strong technical skills and client acquisition success, the firm's internal policies emphasize professional conduct and client centricity, and the relevant regulatory framework mandates that firms ensure their employees act with integrity and in the best interests of clients. What is the most appropriate course of action for the firm? Option A. Implement a formal performance improvement plan focused on developing interpersonal and communication skills, providing targeted coaching, and setting clear behavioral objectives with regular review periods. Option B. Counsel the employee informally, highlighting the concerns without creating a formal record, and trust that they will self-correct their behavior over time. Option C. Acknowledge the client feedback but take no immediate action, relying on the employee's long tenure and strong revenue generation to mitigate the impact of their interpersonal style. Option D. Immediately terminate the employee's contract, citing the pattern of informal client complaints as grounds for dismissal due to a failure to meet professional conduct standards. The correct answer is A. Implement a formal performance improvement plan focused on developing interpersonal and communication skills, providing targeted coaching, and setting clear behavioral objectives with regular review periods. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's established culture and the need to adapt to evolving regulatory expectations regarding employee conduct and ethical behavior. The challenge lies in balancing the desire to maintain a positive and collaborative team environment with the imperative to address potentially detrimental personality traits that could undermine client trust, regulatory compliance, and the firm's reputation. Careful judgment is required to identify and manage these traits without resorting to overly punitive or dismissive measures, ensuring that interventions are fair, constructive, and aligned with professional standards. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a structured, evidence-based, and developmental response. By initiating a formal yet supportive performance improvement plan, the firm demonstrates a commitment to addressing the identified behavioral issues constructively. This aligns with regulatory expectations that firms have robust processes for managing employee conduct and ensuring that individuals meet professional standards. Ethically, it upholds principles of fairness and due process by providing the employee with clear feedback, specific goals, and opportunities for improvement. This approach also safeguards the firm by creating a documented record of intervention should further action become necessary. An incorrect approach that involves ignoring the feedback due to the employee's long tenure and perceived value to the team represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This inaction allows potentially harmful behaviors to persist, increasing the risk of client complaints, regulatory breaches, and damage to the firm's reputation. It signals a lack of commitment to professional standards and creates an environment where poor conduct is implicitly tolerated, undermining the firm's culture and the integrity of its operations. Another incorrect approach, which is to immediately dismiss the employee based on the qualitative feedback without a structured process, is also professionally unacceptable. This fails to provide the employee with natural justice or an opportunity to rectify their behavior. It can lead to unfair dismissal claims and reputational damage for the firm. Furthermore, it bypasses the firm's responsibility to manage performance and conduct through established procedures, which are often implicitly or explicitly required by regulatory bodies to ensure fair treatment and due diligence. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation of the feedback. This includes gathering objective evidence where possible, assessing the impact of the behavior on clients, colleagues, and the firm's operations, and considering the employee's tenure and potential for development. The next step is to consult relevant internal policies and regulatory guidance on performance management and conduct. If behavioral issues are identified, the preferred course of action is to implement a formal, documented performance improvement plan that clearly outlines expectations, provides support and resources for development, and sets a timeline for review. This process ensures fairness, accountability, and compliance with professional and regulatory obligations. Question 20. The evaluation methodology shows a tendency to rely heavily on a single psychometric assessment for determining client suitability for complex investment products, with limited consideration for observed behavioral patterns during client interactions. What is the most appropriate professional response to this methodology? Option A. Advocate for a more comprehensive evaluation process that incorporates multiple assessment methods, including behavioral observation and professional judgment, to ensure a holistic understanding of client suitability. Option B. Recommend focusing solely on the psychometric assessment results, as these provide objective, quantifiable data that is less prone to subjective interpretation than behavioral observations. Option C. Suggests that behavioral observations are inherently subjective and should be disregarded in favor of the more standardized and objective outputs of the psychometric assessment. Option D. Accept the methodology as efficient, assuming the chosen psychometric assessment is widely recognized and therefore sufficient for all client suitability determinations. The correct answer is A. Advocate for a more comprehensive evaluation process that incorporates multiple assessment methods, including behavioral observation and professional judgment, to ensure a holistic understanding of client suitability. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent subjectivity in assessing personality and behavioral traits, especially when these assessments are used for critical decisions like client suitability or employee performance. The challenge lies in balancing objective assessment criteria with the nuanced understanding of individual behavior, ensuring fairness, and adhering to regulatory expectations for robust and unbiased evaluations. Careful judgment is required to avoid misinterpretations that could lead to inappropriate recommendations or decisions. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a multifaceted evaluation that integrates various data points, including structured assessments, behavioral observation, and professional judgment. This aligns with regulatory expectations for thorough due diligence and client care, ensuring that recommendations are based on a comprehensive understanding of the individual's personality and behavioral predispositions relevant to the context. It demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct by seeking to minimize bias and ensure suitability, thereby protecting both the client and the firm. An incorrect approach that relies solely on a single, potentially biased, personality assessment tool fails to meet regulatory standards for comprehensive evaluation. It risks misinterpreting results without contextual understanding, potentially leading to unsuitable recommendations or unfair assessments. This approach exhibits a lack of due diligence and can be seen as a failure to adequately understand the client or employee, which is a breach of professional duty. Another incorrect approach that dismisses behavioral observations in favor of purely theoretical personality profiles overlooks crucial real-world indicators of how an individual actually functions. This can lead to decisions based on an idealized or inaccurate representation of the person, failing to account for practical application of traits and potentially creating a mismatch between the assessment and reality. This demonstrates a failure to apply professional judgment and a disregard for observable evidence. A further incorrect approach that prioritizes speed and efficiency over thoroughness by using a superficial assessment directly contravenes the ethical obligation to conduct a diligent and comprehensive evaluation. This can lead to significant errors in judgment, potentially resulting in financial harm to clients or detrimental impacts on organizational performance. It represents a failure to uphold professional standards and a disregard for the consequences of inadequate assessment. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, clearly define the purpose and scope of the personality and behavioral evaluation. Second, select appropriate assessment tools and methodologies that are validated and relevant to the context, ensuring they are used in conjunction with other information sources. Third, critically analyze the results, considering potential biases and limitations of each tool. Fourth, integrate findings from multiple sources, including direct observation and professional experience, to form a holistic understanding. Finally, document the evaluation process and the rationale behind any decisions or recommendations made, ensuring transparency and accountability.